Well, good morning, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. The hearing will now come to order. I would like to begin by extending a special thanks to each of our agricultural industry witnesses for taking time out of your busy schedules to be able to travel to Washington, D.C., and to be able to appear before this committee. I'd like to especially recognize Mr. Roger Mix, a constituent of mine from Colorado's 3rd Congressional District out of Center, Colorado, and we look forward to everyone's testimony. Today's issue is very important to small agricultural producers and their key role within the American economy. The challenges posed by foreign non-tariff barriers to agricultural trade. Approximately 91% of farming and ranching operations in the United States is classified as small by the United States Department of Agriculture. In comparison to most other industries, agricultural operations depend more heavily on overseas trade for a significant portion of their income. It has often been said that 1 of every 4 acres planted in the United States is planted for the export markets. Overall, exports account for up to 30% of farm income. Agricultural trade is also an important job creator in the United States, and our economy needs job creators right now. According to the Department of Agriculture, farm exports support more than 1 million jobs on and off the farm. Along with many of my colleagues, I believe that more can be done to take advantage of our nation's apparent comparative advantage in agricultural production by further expanding our access to foreign markets. A common tool employed by foreign nations to block U.S. agricultural products is the use of non-tariff trade barriers, predominantly sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Because nations have the sovereign right to be able to block products that pose a threat to human or animal health that could contaminate their food systems, they have used these measures in some instances as a means to be able to block competition. The agricultural community and Congress have taken notice. I've heard from a number of potato and other commodity growers in my district regarding the harm caused to them by unfair trade. These barriers have to be able to be dealt with, and I've personally met with USDA Secretary Edward Avalos to be able to discuss this problem. I'd also like to include, without objection for the record, a letter that we'd sent to Ambassador Ron Kirk in regards to our export of potatoes into the Mexican market as well. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine these issues further and to learn how sanitary and phytosanitary measures have been used as trade weapons against American agricultural producers and the resulting economic impact on all small businesses. I'd now like to yield to Ranking Member Kritz for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I was going very quickly through my statement here as we have votes that could be coming within the next half an hour, 45 minutes, so I'll try to go very quickly so that we can get to your testimony. Right now, job creation is priority 1 for this committee, and that means looking to new markets, whether they are domestic or abroad. One such opportunity lies in agricultural exports, which have exceeded imports since the early 70s. In fact, last year, U.S. agricultural exports reached nearly $140 billion, outpacing the previous record set in 2008 by $23 billion and surpassing 2010's totals by $29 billion. This growth shows that America's farmers are essential to leading our economy forward, spurring development and employment gains throughout the country. Within this sector, small farms play a key role, accounting for 91% of all farms and 23% of overall agricultural production. Not surprisingly, these smaller farms are actively engaged in international trade, which now drives 20% of their employment. This is especially true for my home state. During an April field hearing in Pittsburgh, we heard the significant role that international trade plays in western Pennsylvania's economy. In fact, agricultural exports support more than 20,000 jobs in our state. Further inroads in foreign markets are necessary to generate even more jobs in our local communities. In order to do so, key challenges must be overcome. The breadth of restraints is staggering, and they reach into nearly every product grown or raised on America's farm. For our country's poultry producers, this means that such important markets like China, India, and Japan are off limits. Pork producers cannot export to European Union, Singapore, or even Peru. The impact of this reaches into communities like mine in western Pennsylvania, where local dairy farmers are left with fewer customers even though foreign goods are plentiful in local stores. The truth is that for many, the promises of free trade have never materialized, and America's farms face the prospect of having to compete with foreign imports without having access to those very markets. Reversing unfair practices has been extremely difficult. The U.S. Trade Representative has taken the lead in mitigating the impact of these standards. They have worked to undo restrictions in Japan and Korea on U.S. cherries and citrus, as well as barriers in South Africa and Sri Lanka for apples and seed potatoes. They were also able to get Kuwait and Taiwan to lift unwarranted restrictions on U.S. exports of poultry and poultry products, while it also negotiated for full market access for U.S. beef to the United Arab Emirates. Clearly, this is progress, but more needs to be done if we are going to achieve the President's goal of doubling U.S. exports by the end of 2014. Aside from the bilateral efforts of the USTR, there is a lot riding on Trans-Pacific Partnership. This multi-regional trade pact will ideally set common certification requirements for agricultural products, which will ultimately be adopted by all signees of the partnership. In the essence of time, I would ask unanimous consent if I could enter my full statement into the record, and I want to thank all the witnesses in advance, and I look forward to their testimony.
Thank you, Ranking Member Kretz, and would like to be able to go ahead and start with introducing a constituent of mine for our first portion of testimony this morning, Mr. Roger Mix. He's from Center, Colorado. Was there just a couple of weeks ago. Roger is a fourth-generation farmer and has been active in a number of agricultural producer organizations. Most recently, he served as president of the National Potato Council from 2010 to 2011. Roger is testifying today on behalf of both the Colorado Potato Committee and the National Potato Council. Mr. Mix, thank you for appearing today, and you now may deliver your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning. Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Kretz, and other members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. It is an honor and a privilege to be here. I am here today representing over 170 potato growers in the San Luis Valley of south central Colorado. Colorado produced 21 million hundredweight of potatoes in 2011, with an approximate market value of $200 million. We produce over 100 varieties of potatoes, with 95% marketed as fresh potatoes, which ranks Colorado as the second largest producer of fresh potatoes in the nation. Colorado is the largest United States shipper of fresh potatoes to Mexico, but access has been limited to a 26-kilometer deep area along the northern border of Mexico. The opportunity to expand this market represents a significant economic opportunity for Colorado and other U.S. potato growers. Currently, about 1 in every 5 rows of potatoes grown in the United States is exported, but in Colorado it is only 1 in every 20. I want to thank you for calling this hearing to examine the effects of the application of non-scientifically based sanitary and phytosanitary standards on agriculture products grown in the United States and exported to our valued trading partners. All too often, the application of these standards has resulted in reduced market access for the agriculture grown by America's family farmers who operate small businesses across the country. As we all understand, these small businesses are the heart and the soul of our economy. In March 2003, the United States and Mexico signed a market access agreement that allowed for the shipment of U.S. fresh potatoes from all 50 states into a 26-kilometer deep area along the border of Mexico. The signed agreement called for increased access to the five northern Mexican states in 2004 and for the consideration of full access by 2005. Presently, the shipping of U.S. fresh potatoes to Mexico is limited to 26 kilometers. In 2011, U.S. potato growers exported $39 million worth of fresh potatoes to Mexico, making it our second largest export market behind Canada. If our products had full access to all of Mexico, we estimate that would become a largest market for U.S. fresh potatoes with a value in excess of $150 million. Many of the obstacles raised by Mexico to justify their failure to honor commitments in the 2000 agreement have been phytosanitary in nature, but were not based in sound science and did not justify trade restrictions. For example, Mexican potatoes produced in areas of the country with identical pest profiles as those in U.S. production areas have been allowed to move throughout Mexico if they were washed or brushed and labeled for consumption only. Yet U.S. fresh potatoes exports to Mexico are not allowed to move in a similar manner. The application of a different standard for domestic production than that for imports clearly violates the globally accepted principle of national treatment. Mexico also argues that the pest fines on U.S. potatoes entering Mexico have been excessive. U.S. growers and shippers apply rigorous production and testing protocols to ensure that shipments to Mexico are free from pests. According to USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, legitimate pest fines on the U.S. potatoes entering Mexico are at or below the levels of pest detections for any Mexican agriculture products entering the U.S. The lack of timely and accurate reporting of pest fines is used by Mexico to artificially inflate the number of pest fines. Recently, U.S. and Mexican negotiators were able to reach an agreement on a path forward to develop a market access agreement for U.S. fruit potatoes to Mexico. As Mexico, Canada, and other key trading partners seek to become participants in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we need to be vigilant in using that process to increase the commitments to science-based resolutions of phytosanitary issues. The trade agreement negotiating process provides an opportunity to gauge our trading partners' commitment to the scientific evaluation of phytosanitary risk, as well as our internationally accepted trade rules and standards. We are encouraged at the progress toward expanding potato trade with Mexico, and as of TPP negotiations continue, America's family potato farmers believe there is a need for continued and visible progress on the final work plan that will give potato growers and shippers in Colorado and the rest of the U.S. the opportunity to export potatoes to Mexico. A lack of progress on the potato issue would call into question Mexico's commitment to be a responsible partner in the TPP agreement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Mix. And neglected to mention, and you hit it right on the button, we do have 5 minutes to be able to testify. When you do see the green light on, you're doing great. When the yellow light comes on, you have a minute left. And when the red light comes on, if you would wrap up your testimony, and you did perfect. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Our next witness is Jason Hoffmeister. He is Vice President of Allen F. Johnson & Associates, a trade consulting firm headquartered in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, he works with businesses and associations in identifying trade opportunities and barriers for American agricultural producers. Prior to joining Allen F. Johnson & Associates, he served as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Agriculture, where he led agriculture negotiator at a number of treaty discussions, including the WTO Doha round of trade negotiations, the Central American Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement, and negotiations over China's secession to the WTO. Mr. Hoffmeister, you may deliver your testimony. Thank you for being here.
Great. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Mr. Kritz, and Mr. King. It's good to be here. What I'd like to focus my time here is to summarize 3 of the key points that we face in agriculture when looking at unjustified trade restrictions on our exports. First, right now, U.S. agriculture exports are doing great. But even today, we're performing below our potential because of unjustified health and safety measures applied by other countries. And in the future, we run the risk of even more disruption of our exports as countries revert to unwarranted technical barriers to restrict trade, either to protect domestic industries from competition or for misguided efforts to protect health and safety. The kind of problems our products face, which were, I think, well explained in the case of Mexico and potatoes, range from shipments held up in ports because of concerns about a particular government test that an inspector finds, or production or labeling requirements that other countries employ that force changes in how we have to produce goods if we're going to access the market, or limits on chemicals or other residues that may show up in our products that are more stringent than required by the U.S. laws or international standards, or even just outright bans on our products because of purported concerns about the safety of U.S. products. So these are the reasons, some sincere and some not so, that are used to stop our products. And in the future, we expect it's going to be an even bigger problem as tariffs come down and we conclude other trade agreements. So I don't think there's any dispute about the importance of this. What I think the issue is making them a top priority in U.S. trade policy and implementing effective action plans to improve our export opportunities. Reducing tariffs in other countries or running promotion programs to boost exports will deliver no benefits if our exports can be shut down by unjustified import restrictions. That means the United States need to prioritize staffing, operations, and policies that give our trade negotiators the tools needed to convince other countries to establish science-based health and safety standards and work to facilitate trade rather than trying to block it. In particular, technical agencies such as agencies within USDA, FDA, and EPA need to prioritize discouraging other countries from erecting unjustified barriers and challenging unjustified barriers when they are established. Finally, third point, we have a strong set of principles already to guide us in world trade in the WTO. They require countries to establish science-based measures and encourage them to facilitate trade when there may be different approaches across countries' health and safety systems. But this set of principles needs to be strengthened by prioritizing efforts to foster trade through international standard organizations and through trade negotiations such as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was mentioned earlier. I'll give you two examples. One is the United States needs to work in the Codex Alimentarius to set more common standards that recognize scientific consensus on the safe use of technologies so that countries across the world, when they recognize a product is safe, will allow it to be imported. This is particularly true in veterinary drugs. Similar work is needed in the World Animal Health Organization on animal diseases and in the International Plant Protection Convention on plant pests. Similarly, the United States needs to negotiate agreements with other countries that facilitate trade by delivering enforceable agreements that recognize the U.S. system as delivering high levels of food safety and protection against pests and diseases. Important ideas that should be included in these negotiations include developing common export certificates to reduce the complexity of meeting paperwork requirements, recognition by other countries that the U.S. system, while it may be different in some technical details from theirs, delivers world-class food safety protection against pests and diseases, protection that is equal or higher than that exists in the importing country, and providing procedural safeguards that allow exporters time to comment on and adapt to new measures before they're finalized. America's farm and ranch families include some of the most successful exporters in this country. They, along with the network of food processors, brokers, and trade servicing professionals, depend on keeping U.S. export markets open. Health and safety barriers are the biggest threat to reducing our current exports and can place a cap on their future growth. Moving aggressively to stop these barriers from being put in place or removing those that exist will provide a tremendous benefit to our farmers. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Our next witness, I will now yield to Ranking Member Critz to be able to introduce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce Mr. Carl Schaefer, President of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. Pennsylvania Farm Bureau is the state's largest farm organization with a volunteer membership of more than 50,000 farm and rural families representing farms of every size and commodity across Pennsylvania. Mr. Schaefer also serves on the American Farm Bureau Federation Board of Directors, where he serves on the Trade Advisory Committee. Mr. Schaefer continues to be an active farmer himself, growing vegetables and grains on 1,800 acres of farmland in Columbia County, Pennsylvania. Among the much recognition for leadership and achievement in agriculture, Mr. Schaefer was named as a Master Farmer in 1996, one of the highest honors awarded to farmers in the Commonwealth. Mr. Schaefer, if we could have your testimony.
Welcome. Thank you. Mr. Tipton, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and Ranking Member Critz and the rest of the committee. Trade matters to Pennsylvania and America's farmers. As you well know, more than 95% of the global population lives beyond our borders. As such, agriculture is mindful of global markets, the opportunities they present, and the trade barriers that exist. Previously, barriers to U.S. agricultural trade were mostly confined to tariffs. As tariffs on many agricultural products have been reduced, other forms of barriers have been increased, though they essentially serve the same function, restricting market access. You may have seen a report published by the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative which gives an account of the sanitary barriers maintained by nations against the United States agricultural exports. Within this report, the primary concerns of Pennsylvania agriculture includes restrictions on biotechnology, export health certificates for poultry, pork, dairy, and dairy products, specifically regarding Russia and India, and the increased use of geographic indicators. Formal negotiations between nations can act to reduce tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. However, in negotiating these agreements, we must strive to make sure we benefit the entire agricultural economy, not just parts of it. For example, NAFTA did nothing to address the Canadian tariff on U.S. dairy products. Canada imposes out-of-quota tariffs on dairy products that exceed 200%, with some as high as 292.5%. This is particularly harmful to Pennsylvania's dairy industry in that we could be exporting cheese to our northern neighbors if NAFTA had eliminated or reduced this barrier. U.S. negotiations should use the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations to address these Canadian tariffs and expand market opportunities for America's dairy producers close to home. As you know, the dairy sector has taken several hits on the chin lately. Any effort we can take to find long-term, reliable markets for our dairy products will help decrease price volatility for our dairy farmers. The conversation about geographic indicators as a non-tariff barrier is an emerging and difficult challenge. Pennsylvania's dairy industry is concerned about the common names for dairy products like mozzarella or feta cheese or even Greek yogurt being restricted in use. Affordable and reliable shipping of commodities and farm products is also essential in delivering U.S. agricultural products to foreign consumers and to compete in world markets. Our inland waterways are in need of continuing repair and maintenance to locks to preserve a major domestic shipping advantage that the U.S. has over many other nations in the movement of agricultural goods. Our seaports need to be improved to take advantage of and to be ready for the competition that will come from nations after the expansion of the Panama Canal moves freight into even larger ships that require deeper harbors. Even though Pennsylvania is not often considered to be an agricultural exporter, port infrastructure is a major concern of farms. Lone Maple Farms of New Alexandria in Pennsylvania's 12th Congressional District sells all the soybeans they grow to Agland Co-op in neighboring Ohio. Their beans are loaded on a barge, floated down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and transloaded onto ships headed into Asia. Unfortunately, Gulf Coast ports are not able to accommodate the larger ships that will soon navigate the Panama Canal. The inability to dock, load, and unload the post-Panamanic ships in the Gulf Coast could limit the foreign markets currently enjoyed by Lone Maple Farms and several other Pennsylvania farmers. In closing, America's agriculture depends on export markets. Policymakers must remain committed to reducing sanitary and phytosanitary trade barriers. Moreover, an efficient, reliable, export-oriented transportation system is necessary to get agricultural goods to foreign markets. Agriculture matters to the American economy, and trade matters to agriculture. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. Our final witness today is Mr. Jim Boyer. Jim raises hogs on his family's operation located in Ringsted, Iowa. He also serves on the board of Iowa Farm Bureau and represents Iowa on the American Farm Bureau Swine Advisory Committee. He is also a member of the Iowa Pork Producers Association and will be testifying today on behalf of the National Pork Producers Council. Mr. Boyer, thank you for being here, and we look forward to your testimony.
Good morning, Chairman Tipton, Ranking Member Kritz, and members of the subcommittee. As Mr. Tipton said, I am Jim Boyer, a pork producer from Ringsted, Iowa. My wife Lisa and I and our 3 kids operate a third-generation family farm where we produce corn, soybeans, hogs, and cattle. I appreciate the opportunity to present my views and those of the U.S. pork industry on the application by foreign nations of non-science-based sanitary and phytosanitary measures that restrict market access of U.S. pork and adversely affect small producers like myself. I also appreciate the interest of this committee in assuring that future trade agreements include more robust and effective dispute resolution mechanisms to address the misuse of sanitary measures. The future of the U.S. pork industry and of Americans' family hog farms like mine depend on free and fair trade and the continued access of our exports. The U.S. is the lowest cost producer of pork in the world and the #1 global exporter of pork. In 2011, the United States exported a record $6.2 billion worth of pork, up from $4.8 billion in 2010. Those exports represent nearly 27% of the pork produced in the United States and added almost $55 to the price I receive for each hog I sell. Increasing pork exports is important to more than just pork producers. The U.S. pork industry supports an estimated 550,000 domestic jobs, 110,000 which are a result of pork export. USDA estimates that each $1 billion in meat exported generates about 12,000 new U.S. jobs, meaning that last year's increase in pork exports created about 18,000 new jobs. The growth in the U.S. pork export has been achieved despite significant foreign barriers in the form of unjustified health and sanitary measures. Those barriers are costing the U.S. economy and the pork industry billions of dollars. The U.S. pork industry supports the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but for it to be a 21st century agreement, there must be a market access outcome similar to that achieved in the Korean and the Colombia Free Trade Agreements, and sanitary barriers must be eliminated. A strong SPS chapter with a meaningful dispute settlement provision must be part of the TPP, and sanitary restrictions on pork in all TPP countries must be eliminated. Vietnam alone holds incredible potential but blocks pork with non-science-based restrictions. The only way to gain the support of U.S. pork producers for a final TPP deal will be through a robust outcome in Vietnam and other TPP countries in which all barriers are eliminated. Russia soon will be joining the World Trade Organization. Although Russia established a zero-duty tariff rate quotas for pork as part of its WTO accession commitments, it is highly unlikely that the U.S. pork industry will be able to take advantage of those quotas because of a long list of Russian sanitary barriers. Russian food safety officials recently said they intend to leave these unjustifiable and trade-restrictive measures in place after Russia joins the WTO, and that they may add new restrictions. We need Russia to eliminate its sanitary barriers. The EU should be one of our largest export markets, but because of numerous sanitary barriers, it is currently one of our smallest export markets. We actually export more pork to Honduras than we do to the entire EU. As in the TPP and other trade deals, agriculture, and especially pork, must be included in any EU trade negotiations, and discussions on eliminating sanitary barriers also must be included. It makes no sense to have a standard for our TPP partners and another for the European Union. Taiwan unfairly restricts exports of pork from U.S. pork from hogs that have been fed ractopamine, a feed additive approved by the FDA, 25 other countries, and earlier this month the U.S. Codex. This restriction flies in the face of science. If eliminated, ISU economist Dermot Hayes eliminates or estimates that we could see pork exports to Taiwan increase by an additional $417 million. Taiwan has been campaigning for entry in the TPP, but a country that ignores science, likewise, should have its bid to join the TPP ignored. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we are convinced if we sit by passively while SPS measures are incorrect or erected and maintained, we will see our exports rapidly erode. Pork producers understand that the future of our industry depends on adopting a new and safe technologies and in expanding our exports. We must protect our current market access from unfair barriers, or such expansion will be impossible. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Boyer, and thank all of you for your testimony. And we'll now begin the questioning. And I'll begin, and this, if you could give maybe a brief answer, would appreciate it. And this is for all of the panelists here. A number of associations representing agricultural producers are pushing for inclusion of a WTO plus chapter in future trade agreements. In your opinion, would enforceability of SBS measure requirements improve market access for small producers? Mr. Mix?
I believe it would. Anything that would help, as a fresh potato grower, get access to, the various, export markets, that would, definitely help us and go in the right step.
Mr. Hoffmeister?
Yes, it would. I think the key thing to focus on is the difference between a best endeavors commitment by some other country to something that's actually subject to dispute that we can litigate. And that, I think, is the key question in the negotiation. And without the ability to litigate, it's not worth much.
Great. Mr. Schaefer?
I think without a doubt it would be beneficial with us depending on exporting 30% of what we produce. That's how critical the continuation to expand that market just becomes.
Yes, I believe so also, like the other three gentlemen said. It's imperative to small producers like myself that we have access to these markets. Like I said in my statement, 27% of the pork that we produce here in the United States goes to export markets. If we can expand that, we saw what the dollar value of the Taiwan market is. We look at the value of the Russian market. We've already achieved or seen what we can create by the South Korea and the Colombia trade agreements. So yes, it's definitely going to help small producers like myself.
Mr. Boyer, you spoke a lot about scientific-based testing, to be able to make sure that the products are safe. We all want that. And how many agencies do testing on pork, U.S. agencies?
That I don't know off the top of my head, but I can get you that number. Just assuming it's USDA, FDA, they regulate all the pharmaceuticals that we use, and that's what is standing as a barrier, especially with Russia, the European Union, is as some of the pharmaceuticals that we use, their standards for traceable amounts within the meat. Anything that we produce as a family farmer, I also feed my children what I produce on my farm. So as a producer, I'm not, and as a farmer, I am not going to, and as a father, I am not going to produce something that is going to be detrimental to the health of my kids.
Certainly. We have groups representing, maybe Mr. Hoffmeister, maybe you'd like to be able to speak to this. Groups representing small agricultural producers wrote to USTR regarding their concerns that certain regions, such as the EU, that Mr. Boyer mentioned as well, are overrepresented in international standard setting bodies, and that these regions use these positions to be able to legitimize non-science-based standards. Is this a worthy concern?
I think it's certainly worth attention. The key issue here is that in World Health Organization proceedings, all countries are allowed to attend, and they can all vote on whether or not a certain product is safe or not, say a veterinary drug. One of the concerns we've had is that some of the small countries who may otherwise not attend a meeting or pay attention may find their airfare paid by the European Union and encouraged to vote against a standard that may protect European producers and damage U.S. producers. So we just had a big vote in Rome that the U.S. won, but just barely, on ractopamine, which benefits pork in particular. So the U.S. government did a great job of convincing all these folks, but we were running up against some undue influence, we thought, from other countries. So it's definitely working, making sure these decisions are science-based and not influenced by anything else. But of course, we want to make sure all countries have bought into this process. That requires international organizations, cooperation, consensus. So it's a difficult issue.
Right. Well, thank you for that. We've worked long out of our district to be able to try and work with the Mexican government. We thought about a year ago we got there to be able to get the potatoes out of the San Luis Valley down into the Mexican market. And when you're talking about being limited 26 kilometers into Mexico, Mr. Mix, I understand that some of the potato exports going into Mexico, they've been denied access to by the Mexican officials because they claim that they test positive for certain pathogens. However, those are the same potatoes that are tested in U.S. laboratories and they came up clean. Is this a common practice that you see?
I believe it's getting better. Working with Secretary Vilsack and Undersecretary Avalos, is they've brought this to the attention of the Mexican government. As of February of this year, we've only had one legitimate fine. So the fines have dropped due to the talks with the NAPO panel. They have dismissed a bunch of the fines. They were a lot of them were like PVY viruses that they were finding, but they have the same viruses in Mexico that we do in the United States. So they decided to dismiss the viruses. So it is getting better. But the thing that halters the shipments into the 26 kilometers is if they find a find or a pest, it's the timeliness that they get back to the growers, and then it just distorts everything. So you have to wait a certain period of time before you can export from that shed again. So if they find a pest, they hold up the proceedings and take their time before they let the grower know what they did find. And if there was a second test in the United States lab, it just takes a time to do it. So that's the bad part about it.
Great. Thank you. I'd now like to yield to Ranking Member Kritz for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I ask my first question, I did want to recognize a special guest that came down with Mr. Schaefer and the Farm Bureaus, Jenna Moser, who is in the audience. She's a candidate for the FFA National Officer Team and came along to learn about the public policy process in agriculture in general. So, Jenna, welcome to the hearing. I hope this is helpful in your future, and thanks for being a young person who's interested in the future of agriculture in this country. With that said, Mr. Schaefer, you had mentioned about inland infrastructure, water infrastructure, the inland waterways, and you and I had discussed very briefly when the Panama Canal gets finished, and you mentioned that as well in your testimony. And if you would just elaborate, and if anyone else wants to jump in on this as well, elaborate on what you see as what's going to be happening as these larger barges come online, what the impact is going to be to agriculture, and sort of, if you have a crystal ball, what the timing is. What you think. When do you think the impact is really going to hit us?
Okay. As I indicated in my testimony, with the opening up of the new Panama Canal, the post-pandemic ships are so much larger, they're going to be able to accommodate them through the canal. Unfortunately, according to USDA, there is only 6 ports in the United States that will be able to accept these larger vessels. Now, if we expect them to go to the Bahamas and be offloaded on another smaller ship and to accommodate a U.S. port, our economic competitiveness is just going to drop to nothing. We're going to be uncompetitive. Now, if we don't wake up and address the infrastructure in our ports and harbors in this country to accept these larger vessels, as other countries have done who have invested billions of dollars in infrastructure upgrades, we're going to be left behind. And as you know, for instance, it's my understanding New Orleans cannot accept these larger vessels. And that's where the majority of a lot of our agricultural products are funneled down the Mississippi, loaded on these ships for export. So I think in the future, it's going to be very critical to address this situation, and it's going to come sooner than later.
Yeah. Anyone else like to?
Well, I concur with Mr. Schaefer said too. And this is outside my realm of pork, but as a producer from the Midwest, a lot of our agricultural raw products, be it soybean or corn, move down the Mississippi River. As we see the impacts of the drought this summer, a lot of that traffic has been curtailed, or they're moving it at a much larger expense because of the draft of the barges and such.
Right.
As we look at our competition, especially in the soybean area, we look at the expenditures or the investment that other countries are making in their infrastructure. One of our biggest competitors for soybean is Brazil. And we look at the share of the soybean production that China is now buying from Brazil because they can move that product a lot more efficient than we can.
Thank you. And this question's for Mr. Schaefer and for Mr. Mix about what the TPP means for farmers in Pennsylvania or farmers in general. Now, in Pennsylvania, my question was centered around dairymen and the problems exporting to Canada. But one of the questions I wanted to ask, too, is do we send potatoes as well to Mexico, is that part of our market, or is that too far from Pennsylvania? We don't export to Mexico. But what would the TPP mean to dairy, potatoes in both of your instances?
We ship very little potatoes to Mexico, but I will tell you this. When I look at trade, whatever leaves any part of the country is making room for the rest of the product in the country. Okay. So whether it leaves from Colorado, that opens up more markets for our potatoes on the East Coast or anything else. I see. So that really has that effect. Yeah. In dairy, as I said, our dairy farmers really have been taking a beating on price the last couple of years. And in this country, we're about at maximum consumption of dairy products for all practical purposes. So the only opportunity is exports, and that's why it's so vital to the dairy industry.
I would agree with the statement of Mr. Schaefer on, on exports. If Colorado does, get the Mexican, to all the nation, that market, it allows the potato movement in the United States to open up, and there's less potatoes. So it's like the supply and demand curve that everybody knows in the economics. We're, as a potato industry right now, we're watching the negotiations of the TPP and to see how that goes and to see what the reactions of the Mexican government is to that, to, go forward with it. I think that would be definitely help to us as an industry in Colorado, being with our locality to Mexico, the freight advantage that we do have. So that's where we're at with the TPP, is just watching the negotiations and where it's going to go here in the next 80, 90 days.
Okay. Well, thank you. And because I know we're going to have votes here shortly, I have about a dozen questions, but I will yield back so that we can get to our other members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kritz. And we actually have had votes called now, and that series will run until about 1 o'clock. And I do want to recognize and give Mr. King and Mr. Keating an opportunity to maybe ask a question before we do move on to vote. So I'd now like to...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd first inquire how much time is left on the clock at the vote. Pardon?
9 minutes.
9 minutes. So normally here we would be able to head over that way with a couple minutes left, but I appreciate being recognized and appreciate the witnesses. I regret I had to step out of the room and miss the opportunity to introduce Mr. Boyer, who comes from, I'll call it my neighborhood in Iowa. And some things call us away, and we have simultaneous committee meetings and hearings going on in this town on a regular basis. I wanted to start with Mr. Mix and ask you, do you know if there's aside from these issues that you've testified, do you know if there is a foreign entity out there that has regulated your means of production, that has said you have to raise potatoes in a certain way?
I'm not aware of a foreign entity. There's protocols that we have to meet to ship to Mexico, the brushing of dirt off, and we have to apply a storage product so they do not sprout. But as far as a foreign entity, I'm not aware of one.
Are there any regulations that you know of that would regulate how you raise potatoes that could not be identified at the border? For example, application of a treatment to the potato or the cleaning those potatoes, they can look at that potato and examine it and tell whether you've done what they've asked, correct?
Yes.
So there's no regulation that you know from a foreign entity that regulates the means of production, just the product itself.
Right. They don't. There's no means of regulating in how we grow the actual potato.
Okay, and I like that kind of world. But Mr. Schaefer, I'd ask you, do you know of any regulations of any means of production that you have to comply with that cannot be identified by examining the product?
No, I'd only refer to limited exports because of biotechnology issues some countries put on us. I consider that a production tool that I use, so that might be one of the means you refer to.
But that would be GMO?
Correct.
And don't we know also that can be examined in the lab to determine the GMO identity?
Correct.
Like Roundup Ready beans, for example?
Yes.
And so we know that that technical fee has been applied to soybeans coming in from Argentina into Brazil over the years and charged back again. So I understand your answer, and I appreciate it. I'd like to turn to Mr. Boyer and say, do you know of any regulations of the means of production that come from an outside entity, outside of Iowa or the country, that cannot be identified by observing the product and examining it, but only can be a regulation on your means or method of production?
At this time, I'm not aware of some, but I think if we're not cognizant about it, it will come to fruition. We see what's going on within our own country between states. California requiring some kind of identifying of a product if it was raised in a cage or not in a cage. I know for a fact you can't tell from a pound of bacon if that pig was castrated using euthanasia or using anesthetics, or if that sow was housed in a gestation crate or an open in an open pen. But at the same time, we're seeing through the European Union some of our processing practices. One of the problems that the European Union had was the color of the walls in the processing plants, and also the style of molding used in the processing plants. Those have been addressed by some of the packers, but it's still one of those issues that they're using what they're saying are sanitary or phytosanitary measures, but they're accurately not being portrayed that way.
Aesthetics for hogs or aesthetics for the people that are processing them?
I couldn't answer that. I'm not from France or
Belgium. You would take that, I think.
Yes.
But in any case, what you've identified, Mr. Boyer, is the trade protectionism by regulating the means or method of production. When that happens from a foreign country, we see that as trade protectionism. When that happens within the United States, state to state, it's still trade protectionism. The Constitution of the United States reserves the regulation of interstate commerce to the Congress and prohibits it to the states for that very reason, because they didn't want to set up trade wars between the states. Now we're seeing this emerge in the ag community with regulations of gestation crates, stalls for veal calves, how you feed ducks and geese for liver, the egg piece, and it'll be broilers next. And so I'm just suggesting that the language that we have written into the Farm Bill now that prohibits the states from regulating the means of production of ag products is an important piece of language and legislation that must go into law, or we'll see in the United States trade wars by regulating the means of production that are worse than the trade competition that you've testified to here today. So I thank you, all of the witnesses, and I thank the chairman for calling this hearing, and I yield back the balance of my time, even realizing it's a minus 14 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. King. And Mr. Keating, I'd like to be able to yield to you, and we can see how much time we have left for
Not much, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your comments on infrastructure improvements, particularly seaport infrastructure improvements. I think the same thing could be said for rail as well. That would be helpful in our country, not just for agriculture, but for manufacturing. Now, I come from a huge cranberry growing area, and I was going to ask you, I'm also on foreign affairs, have you been helped at all by any of the U.S. missions or any diplomacy? I noticed in cranberries, in Turkey there's a market. They don't even have a word for the cranberries. And in Italy just recently, they just were still calling it red fruit. So have you had any help from the U.S. missions in terms of trying to take some of the informal barriers, not the strict ones, but the ones that are just very real but maybe sometimes unintended?
With the potatoes in Mexico, where we've been helped down there mostly is the retailers and the wholesalers trying to get their point across to their government that there is a market for the United States potatoes going in there. So we're working through that avenue to get them on board with us to relay their point of view in their own country that there is a market for United States fresh potatoes in Mexico. So we're not using missions but other avenues.
Okay, quickly, the Import-Export Bank, are all of you utilizing that? How effective is that? We just reauthorized that. Is it helpful? The Export-Import Bank, is that helpful to any of you?
I'm not aware of any help on that.
Great. Mr. Boyer?
I think any influence that we can see from our federal government to help us open these other countries to our exports, which in fact increases our bottom line and helps us, is appreciated.
Great. Thank you. With the seconds ticking, I'll yield back the rest of my time. And I thank all of you for coming.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses again for taking the time to be able to appear before us today. We do apologize for having to move a little quicker than we would like in regards to the votes that we have coming up. You've all provided insight to this committee, and we pledge to be able to work with you to ensure that American exports, agricultural products, and otherwise receive fair treatment in international markets. I'd like to be able to ask for unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to be able to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. The hearing is now adjourned.